Welcome to High Point, Seb.
Thank you very much for having me, Mike.
Um, I've got a few questions to ask you around your background, your architectural studies, not studies in English, you say university. What you did with ACAN and Timber Development UK and NMITE as well, and ASBP. You're a passive house designer. I, as an acquisition, have an idea of what this is, but maybe you can detail a bit more. What's your current role at Archetype? A few interesting projects could be interesting to mention. Your house project that I didn't list, I didn't write down, but I'm interested to know more details, and yeah, what the current work is being done in decarbonizing the construction in the UK. I'd be really interested to hear that because I think you've got a good insight or a better insight than me. So yeah, but first of all, can I ask you to introduce yourself the way you would like to be introduced?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, Mark. I'm Seb Laan Lomas. I'm an associate archetype architect at Architype Architects. We're a multidisciplinary design practice with 3 studios now in Edinburgh, Hereford, and London. I luckily get to work out of our Hereford office, which is a beautiful barn at the top of a hill, which is really a very nice way of being reminded about the importance of environmental design on a daily basis, which is fantastic. As a company, we exist to be kind of thought leaders, progressive, doing what needs to be done. We have been kind of pioneering Passivhaus and NMITE, which is the retrofit version, for the last 14 years. We've delivered about 200 projects to that level at the moment, which is brilliant. And we're a bio-based material first practice, which if you will have looked at any of our projects, you'll probably have seen some thatch in use and lots of timber in different exciting ways. So I work there, been there for a couple of years now. And I work across our 3 studios as a kind of building performance evaluator and expert, also supporting our research innovation work, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, and also helping our clients think about decarbonization at a statewide level when they've got portfolios of buildings.
You know what? I'm just realizing the first project I worked on with Archetype was quite a while ago, and it was a passive house school where I'd never heard about passive house school before. So I can kind of confirm about the pioneering aspect of. So what's your background, and what made you want to be an architect?
That's a good question. I quite enjoyed your conversation with Kelly Harrison on a previous episode. It seems like we both ended up in our professions by what's the word? Not by first preference. I actually originally wanted to be an engineer, and when I went to my maths teacher to say I wanted to study further maths so I could go and study engineering at university, he just looked me straight in the eyes and he said, "You're not good enough," and and that completely changed
Nice.
my trajectory through life, which is quite entertaining. So I went to London for a kind of expanding my mind kind of weekend, and there was an amazing exhibition on at the V&A on modernism. And like a lot of architects, when you find out about modernism and this idea that you can change the way that people live their lives through buildings, that's quite an exciting opportunity and prospect. And that's what just captured my imagination. And I then went back to another teacher and I said, I really want to study architecture. And they said, well, why haven't you been studying art? So it seems like I really hadn't prepared myself for a career in architecture. So I had to go to art college and did a foundation year, which was brilliant at the Slade. And then I reapplied for university, got my position to study architecture, and yeah, the rest is history, I guess.
It's quite interesting because when my sister is an architect in France, and at the end of my master's in mechanical engineering, architectural, architectural acoustics, we had some modules on architecture, and I thought, oh, I hate architecture. I wouldn't want to be an architect, because what we had to do didn't seem very interesting to me. But then now, as I went through my career, I thought it's actually really interesting, and I really like it. I would really like maybe not requalify as an architect, but do more architecture. But yeah, I'm an acoustic consultant. I'm very happy with what I'm doing at the moment. So how long does it take to be a fully qualified architect? Sounds like it's taking quite a long time.
Yeah, I think no one becomes an architect unless they really are committed to it, and achieving that point. So I think the fastest you can get through it used to be 7 years, 8 years. And you've got to do 3 degrees. So you do your part 1, which is a 3-year course, which for me was at Cambridge and very much started at the kind of like design ethos. And I think their vision is that because you're going to spend 7 years before you actually get to be a qualified architect, capital A, they start with all of the artistic intention, knowing that through your 7 years, that's going to get like squashed down by all of the other bits that you need to learn about contract law and land law and project management. And so they start with all design. And so my part 1 was 3 years for my undergraduate. And it was actually just at the end of that point that I really got ignited about the idea of environmental design. And I actually finished my part 1 kind of like really ready and excited about specializing in environmental design. Then you have to do a part 2 course, which is 2 more years in architectural design. But between those two, you're intended to do a year in industry. And that's really, really important to make sure that you're kind of like grounding yourself as you go through this long journey in the reality of what it will actually be to be an architect. Because what you do at university can be very different from what you do in your day job. I was actually really lucky to get to do a year in industry before I did my undergraduate. And I never actually wanted to leave the job. There was a wonderful, wonderful practice in London called Aros. And I actually said, can I just not go back to university? Can I just stay with you? And they pleaded and convinced me that, go to university, have a brilliant time. You can always come back to the same job. I really respect them for that.
And did you come back?
I didn't. Well, actually, I did. I did for a short period because when I graduated from Cambridge, it was the end of the financial recession, and getting a job was unbelievably challenging. I think I sent out 100 applications, took 3 months to get one interview. Unfortunately, I was offered that position, but I actually worked in architectural consultancy, doing a lot of post-occupancy evaluation and using post-occupancy to inform the brief writing for a new building for a client, which is actually, quite, it's really progressive, and it doesn't happen nearly enough. And it's what REBA and a lot of organizations would want to be happening all the time. So whilst it was a very atypical kind of part 1 experience, it was actually for me really, really formative. And it was through conversations with one of my colleagues there that I was introduced to the Center for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth. And that's where I went on to do my part 2 degree, which is an amazing place in Wales. And it was set up in the 70s by some activists who came back from California in the oil crisis and the kind of environmental mobilization that happened around that. And they set up this kind of just creative space to think and do in this abandoned quarry. And then over the years, it became a kind of a center for engaging with members of public around environmental matters and issues and what you could do at a domestic scale and bigger scale. Then they became a more recognized educational institution, and now they do masters, and they've got some amazing buildings. If you've never been, I really encourage a visit. It's quite incredible. It's got the largest rammed earth building in Europe, which is a cylindrical lecture theatre. The residential buildings that you stay in are a swathe of ideas. So they've got an original Walter Siegel self-built house, which you get to do an airtightness test on when you study there, which is amazing because you really get to understand how impactful leaky buildings are. They've got eco cabins with PVs, which are kind of, 40 years old. They've got a straw bale lecture theatre that Architype actually built for them back in the day. And their most recent accommodation is made out of hempcrete and Brett Staple, which is, so it's an ode to all of the wonderful things that you can do in construction. Really recommend it. And it's also where I happen to meet my wife. So I'm, it's all these things, and fate all ended up pointing me to Wales. And then you have to do your part 3, which is your third exam. And that's much more around contracts and law, environmental law, land law, management, contract management. But again, you're meant to do a year in industry before you do that. And that's when I went to London and I worked at Hopkins Architects, alongside which I did my part 3 at Westminster. And that's finally when you're able to call yourself a qualified architect, which is, it's an amazing moment. And we always like to really celebrate colleagues in the office when they finally get to that moment of qualifying as an architect, because it's a lot of dedication and time and sleepless nights to get there.
It's like being a doctor. You're not called a doctor, but you could pretty much, you got the title of architect, I guess.
Just without the pay. I mean, that's...
Yeah, I think in France you only do it for over 5 years, like I'd say a standard master. You do have work experiences you have to take, and even as engineers, like 1, 3, and 6 months we had to take, and it's very similar for architects. But not 7 or 8 years. How much scientific and technical topics do you have in your curriculum?
Do you mean in order to study architecture, or when you're studying architecture?
In order to, when you study architecture, because obviously it's an art degree, but how much technical? And you've been talking about learning legal stuff, but it sounds like there's a lot to cover.
There is, and they're actually currently trying to re-envisage the educational journey to make it more compressed, which is happening at the moment. But it depends on where you end up studying ultimately. You end up, going through, normally you go to different institutions for the 3 degrees that you do. And your second one is kind of always, a lot of people see it as an opportunity to focus into one aspect of architecture that they feel more passionate about. So that can end up being very, very specific and honed. And you can end up, so for example, I ended up focusing on environmental design and studies. And that did involve bits of technical work that you wouldn't have done at another degree. For example, like we were using the Passivhaus planning package Excel tool at our part 2 course, which some universities do, which is brilliant, but some don't. But the part 1, again, it will depend on where you end up studying. I was fortunate enough to get to study at Cambridge, which I think gives a fairly rounded kind of approach to that first degree. We had some very kind of design focused conversations and tutors, but we also had an amazing environmental design tutor who had an amazing lab where he kind of challenged concepts of natural ventilation. And most people will have seen diagrams of buildings cut in half where you have cold air coming in through the windows on the ground floor and then heating up from the people, and then you get convective rise and stack effect, and then the hot air leaves out the top window and then cold air is drawn in. And what he did is he made perspex models of buildings with openings, and he had heating elements, little wire coils for people and computers. And then he submersed the whole thing in a fish tank. And he had blue
Really?
dye at the inlets of the cold, fresh air. And then he had red ink, which he added where you had the heating elements. And then he shone a projector through this whole model. And you had on the wall, you could see all of the eddy currents of the little heat kind of waves coming off these elements. And then he would let the steady state establish where you had the hot air, hot water rising and the cold water being blue, being drawn in. And you got that perfect diagram that we've all seen. Then he put his hand in the tank and he would like wobble it like a salmon's tail. And he said, but then we have, turbulence comes along and you see this kind of like hot, stale air going down the chimney and kind of like messing with everything. And you get hot air coming out the bottom of it and cold air coming in from the top. And so just proving the point that most people's kind of like conversations around natural ventilation are very, very kind of like one version of. And he was actually challenged every year against MIT, who were trying computational fluid dynamics to demonstrate what he was talking about. And every year his perspex boxes were deemed to be more accurate than CFD analysis, just because of how complicated all of those interrelationships are. Anyway, so that was Torwong Vidyakar, my environmental studies teacher, and he kind of very much challenged us, whilst we were making nice little architectural models out of cardboard. He was, yeah, but what is this doing? How does this work? Really interrogating it, which was challenging, I'll say.
I love teachers like this. We had some similar teachers, but there's so much dedication to teaching and coming up with some good course and experiments as well, and spending so much time doing it and preparing it. When did you start focusing on sustainability, decarbonization? Because obviously it's like, to me, it's like you've got a bit of a stamp, which is, I guess you must be happy with. But yeah, when did you start looking at it seriously?
Yeah, so that all happened in my third year at Cambridge. So I had two very influential lecturers. The first, Felipe Fernandez, was talking to us about the difference between pedagogical design and what happens in reality, the performative. And at the time, those words completely baffled me. I left the lecture hall having no idea of what the words meant. And I think I've got a better understanding of it now. But ultimately, it's the difference between how a designer envisages a building being used and the reality of how it is used. And there are some examples in history where a building has been able to be reinterpreted by its users time over time over time, and the building has kind of allowed that to happen. And you get this long-term kind of like beauty of this reinterpretation. People will say, like, the Victorian townhouse is a really good example of that. It's a robust form that can kind of keep on being reimagined. And you've also got the other end of the spectrum where architects had a very strong idea of how a building would be used, and actually it never facilitated the way that people were going to use that building, or it grates, or people demolish it because it's so at loggerheads. And that's a kind of bad example of where it hasn't been able, or hasn't facilitated, or for whatever reason, it hasn't kind of enabled that transition to how people are actually going to use it. And there's a famous story going back to my inspiration, Le Corbusier. Allegedly, he was actually being sued when the World War broke out because he built a house for a client, and every time they wanted to change something, like add a doormat or put in a cupboard, they had to get written permission from him in order to do so. So the story goes. And they sued him on the grounds that they hadn't actually given them a home because of all of these restrictions and how sterile this environment was. And there are other tragic examples, like Mies van der Rohe, I think, never wanted to go back and see his buildings being used because of the negative impact that people had on their buildings. And obviously, I kind of am the complete other end of the spectrum to that. And if it doesn't, and I think societally and industry wise now we're much better at that. And, if it doesn't work for the people, the building just doesn't work. So I had that kind of like inspiration moment. And
Sorry, which
alongside
house was
that,
it that you? Which house was it that Le
I can't
Corbusier
remember,
was?
I'm afraid. I can't
Is that
remember.
the
And it might not even
Is it the one in
go
Paris,
for it.
in La Villa Savoie? Does that ring a bell?
I
No.
don't know.
I say that because we
Um,
visited it last year with my family. We did hear about it, but I'd never visited before. So it was really interesting.
yeah. I mean, buildings are phenomenal and they're beautiful, and you can see like why it all happened, especially this moment post-war. But I'm really glad that kind of, especially the work that I get to work on at Archetype, it is very user focused, and and to me, if it doesn't work for the people, the building doesn't work. So alongside that, at university, I had a wonderful set of lectures around food and cities, and it was Caroline Steele, and she has a brilliant TED talk that I recommend you look up. And it was all basically about how beautifully connected the development of human society and our cities has always been to food, and how we use food, how we move food. London's got these wonderful examples of bread lane and all these fish lanes, and it kind of it literally is because that's how we moved and processed and consumed food. And then she tells us the story of how things have been devolving since then, and we had the death of the high street and automated shopping and supermarkets, and we've got this now very dissociated relationship with food and climate change. And I started seeing all these numbers and how significant our decisions have been, or rather how influential and impactful those decisions, consciously or not, have been now at a global scale. And from looking at these two things, I started looking at our existing building stock. And this was back in, I think, 2009, and starting to kind of really start seeing the figures of how impactful retrofitting our buildings were. That's when I saw the stat that, 80% of our 2050 building stock is already with us. So we can't build our way out of the climate disaster. We have to deal with our existing building stock. And so that's what I focused on as my dissertation. And then from then on, it was always environmental aspects of design and construction and the built environment, which kind of beautifully dovetailed into this atypical part one experience I got at Alexia Marmot Associates, where we were analyzing the use of existing buildings. I mean, it was very, very kind of like detailed and forensic. We set up observation routes that people would walk every hour, on the hour, every day for a week with a clipboard, and they would kind of note how many people were in each space and what activity they were doing. And this was all manual, and we'd put it into a massive Excel spreadsheet, and then you'd run these calculations, which were sheets long, and you'd get these amazing graphs that would show you your utilization rates across all the spaces by, campus, by language, class type. And you could see, well, actually, on Wednesdays, you're only at 30% utilization. So rather than build a new building, let's maximize the use of this building better. And some of that work still happens, but it's really not done enough. And I've seen some nice examples of being able to kind of make clients realize that you don't need a new building. You can just use your existing buildings better. And sometimes it takes those numbers to make people really kind of like see the potential.
It's really interesting and could, in the sound like, obviously we've got different references and I would say topics of interest. Obviously, reading stuff, but I've never actually gone through what you're describing there, and so it's quite interesting. I'd like to read more about it. And also, I'm just thinking the way we got introduced sustainability wasn't so much like as a course, but it was more because I did mechanical engineering the first 4 years. We were studying fluid dynamics and stuff and material resistance. And the teachers were telling us, were just happening to show us their labs. And they were telling us, oh, we're studying the currents in the world and in the oceans and air movements and stuff like this. And thus, we actually found this, and that's quite interesting. So, you kind of take that for granted, but it's nothing on the sustainability of buildings and the reuse of buildings and retrofitting until way after, a few years after you're a consultant, and you do more design and you're more alert and aware of the impact of your design. That you realize, oh, there's actually quite a lot of bad materials that we recommend.
It is, I completely agree with you. And looking back on it, I find it staggering yet how much education just almost happens like without intention. Like, for example, when you start drawing things as a first year student, you just draw 2 lines as a wall. And then at some point you start hatching between those 2 walls. And then you realize, well, you're drawing a concrete wall, and you just draw things, and that's how you just draw things. And rather than thinking, okay, how do we build walls? What are our options for building walls? Okay, rather than drawing 2 lines, how about we draw it as a framed construction? And that puts you in a completely different direction to 2 lines that you hatch in between. Yeah.
And it goes. I'm not going to go into that topic, but the topic about food, the way we eat food, what type of food we eat, and so many people in our generation realize, oh, I need to be vegetarian or vegan, because it's actually quite bad. Well, not bad, but no judgment to anybody who's not vegetarian or vegan. But that's my own realization. Like, as you go in life, you realize, oh, well, this is actually not true what I've got told, or I didn't know this. Continuous education is important, isn't it?
I agree. And I think numbers for me have always been the kind of thing that have swayed my position and views on things. Because for me, maybe it's my mind, when I see the numbers, I really understand the relativity of things. Have you ever read the book How Bad a Banana Is, Mark? I hugely recommend it. Buy yourself a Christmas present this year. You can get a second-hand version online for about £3.
Go on.
It's an incredible book, and it's called How Bad a Banana Is, and it's written by the son of the guy who invented the internet, Mike Berners-Lee, and it's written from the perspective of trying to create a level of understanding around carbon intensity and things. So it starts with the smallest carbon footprint, which is a full stop on a page of paper, and it ends up with like Third World War, and there's the whole spectrum in between. And it also talks about relativity, so the difference between a vine-ripened cherry tomato and a kind of like large plum tomato. And it goes into the nuances there. And then very cleverly, the book is written from the perspective of a one planet living lifestyle. So it says, like, in order for us to be one planet, we need to have an annual carbon footprint of around X tons. And then it talks about things as a percentage of that budget. So, for example, a return flight to the East Coast of America is 6 months of your carbon budget for the year. And then you're like, oh, right, okay. So, and it only takes you 6 hours. So it's like you've like churned through half of your year's carbon budget in 6 hours. And for me, like those kind of things, led me down a plant-based diet. My wife and I haven't flown for 10 years, and it's just those things you're like, really, really significant impact.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done,
10 years.
Well,
It's has been challenging for sure. Means like I went to Italy this year by train, took 22 trains to get to Italy and back. But I had an amazing time. 22. But I got to stay with 3 different sets of families with their kids on the way down and back, which is, a really nice kind of part of the adventure.
Yeah. we're trying as well, as much as we can to drive or not get the train. Train is very expensive for families, so it's best to drive. But yeah, we want to also limit the number of times we get the plane. Unfortunately, I need to do it for work sometimes. So, and in a way, I get told off by my wife for doing it. But then there's time and time constraints. I would be happy to take the train to. I actually had a look. I had to go to Latvia, and then I had to look at getting the train there, but it would take me 2 or 3 days instead of just 1 day. So we thought, okay, 2 planes. But yeah, I wrote the name of the book, and it's definitely going to be on the list.
Make sure you get version 2 because it includes the carbon footprint of Zoom calls and also electric e-bikes, which I won't give the spoiler alert about, but it's quite fascinating.
So is it bad to have an e-bike then?
Okay, I will give the spoiler alert. E-bikes are amazing. In the book, it talks about the carbon intensity of cycling a mile, and basically it comes down to, well, what food are you fueled by? Because if you're like leaves and greens from your garden, barely no carbon footprint. If you're cheeseburgers, it's pretty bad carbon footprint. And if it's air freighted asparagus, it's worse than driving a car, which, is really, really interesting. Anyway, the e-bike, because we've got a relatively decarbonized grid, the the carbon footprint per mile on an e-bike is so much smaller than cycling it by person because of our significant carbon footprint as humans. We're just quite inefficient. We have to consume a lot of calories in order to put out some power onto a bicycle. So even though you've got the embodied carbon up front of your e-bike, life cycle wise, e-bikes are, a huge, huge win, which is really kind of not what you would expect, because you'd think, well, I'm just cycling a bicycle, but our food has a huge carbon footprint.
The marker, it'll be extracted as a short or a reel. There's on the topic of books, and then we'll go back to architecture. There's a book I really like, and it's called Where the Animals Go, and it shows very nicely, like it summarizes loads of studies on with just maps. There's some text as well, a lot of text explaining everything. But the main thing is having very, very nicely designed maps of, for example, they've been studying sharks and where sharks were going, and they thought that it was always the same shark coming back at the same place, but actually they realized that it was very different sharks, and they were like traveling so much. So it was helping all the locals to manage the interactions with humans and sharks and trying to redivert the sharks somewhere else so that they wouldn't approach, or like where the wolves would go, so that they can avoid the wolves from attacking the sheep, and loads of things like seal, how deep they actually dive is really interesting. They can dive very, very deep. So, all this is really interesting. And there's the same author's got another book, 2 other books, but there's one that showed about slave trade. I showed, in our mind, we think that the slave trade started from Africa, and they were all going to North America. But actually, it was the Portuguese that started everything. And there's a lot of slaves that went to Brazil. And the Americans or the Brits saw that opportunity, saw that it was a great business model, and they took it away. But in statistics, there's been so much more traffic of slaves going straight to Brazil.
Wow.
And it was also saying in terms of population, there's a very wide, a very huge black population in Brazil that we don't know, and there's still a lot of problems between folk. There's a lot of racism still in Brazil, and I thought it's crazy because, you know, for example, when we watch football, we think it could be a picture of the demographic, but obviously Brazilian teams don't have any, or have very little black players, for example, or any other sports. So I thought it was really interesting. It was talking about all this. I think it's really interesting. Anyway, books. It's finished. So the first time I met you, it was during COVID, and it was on a call. I think it was Zoom call about ACAN Architects, Climate Action Network, and why did you join ACAN, and what did you do there? Sounds like you were quite active with them. You're not working with them at all anymore.
Not at the moment, no. My wife and I stepped away to prioritize on my house build, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. So I was introduced to the Architects Climate Action Network just before COVID. They introduced themselves at a REBA sustainability weekend, and they basically said, we know that things need to change. We don't have all the answers, but that we hope that through creating a network, we'll be able to connect the dots, find the people with the answers, and help get those answers out there more broadly. And I was really drawn to that humility. And then I heard about them again because of the Future Home Standard consultation. So I don't know if people will remember, but just before COVID, Letty and ACAN did a campaign around this consultation. And it was the first time I had been involved in a government consultation on something like building regulations. And I was shocked by how little representation there has historically been in the consultation of these absolutely pivotal documents. And I understand why. You know, we're all exceptionally busy, and it's not something that's really kind of brought to our attention necessarily from but our industry bodies are doing a better job of that now. Anyway, we came up with some really important messaging to help people understand how to get involved with the consultation, to make sure the government understood how concerned we were by some of the proposals. For example, the Future Home Standard didn't address or even mention embodied carbon, which we thought was a huge kind of shortfall given how significant it's going to be for setting the direction of our new build homes. So I started getting involved with ACAN, which was in its formative moment and that at that point in time. So I was a part of their steering group, talking about the structures internally, but also the thematic groups. And that's the kind of external bit that most people would know ACAN through. For example, at the moment, the natural materials group of ACAN has been very involved with setting up ongoing dialogues. They had recently had one about paints and finishes, which was absolutely fascinating and really eye-opening around what goes into our household paints. Anyway, so I was
sorry, I'm going to stop you there. And yes, yeah. I completely agree. And I had Simon Corby a few days ago, and is the previous episodes, and he talks about paint as well, and how bad paints are that we put in our house. Even just the paint we put in our drain is very, very bad and full of plastic, which was a massive eye opener for me. Sorry.
I know. It's scary. It was a really kind of scary one, because it's like, okay, so people didn't like the off-gassing that was happening from paints. Okay, so we'll swap out the bad stuff and put in plastic instead. It was like, this really wasn't what anyone wanted as the outcome. Anyway, so I was a coordinator of the Embodied Carbon group of ACAN, which was an amazing opportunity because it was before It was before, I think, there was this watershed moment for the industry. And now, the amount of conversation that we hear about environmental product declarations and embodied carbon regulations, it's phenomenally advanced compared to, back in, pre-COVID. And through this group, we led a number of campaigns. So obviously the first one was the Future Home Standard consultation. Then quite shortly after, and that campaign led to, I think, 4,000 people responding to that consultation, which was the most it was the highest number of engagement of any government consultation on the building regulations thus far. And, really kind of, government listened at that point in time. And then they held a consultation, which was about the use of combustible materials in construction. And this was a regulation that was brought in the day after Grenfell. There was a kind of like a very of the moment ban on the use of combustible materials in residential buildings. And it said, and after 12 months, there will be a consultation on how this is going. Only one architect was involved in that original consultation on that, that ban, which became absolutely, pivotal in the direction of the industry.
Who is it?
And
which architect?
I can't remember. I don't even know if it's available online, but when we found out that, we were like, okay, we really need to make sure that the industry kind of sits up, listens, feels empowered to engage in this. And the problem was it was talking about fire, which is something that, as an architect, you really don't get a huge education in when you're at university, but we have to work with that regulation, for everything that we do. So we did a lot of research ourselves. We spoke to a lot of people in the industry. We came up with a industry response, like our position response. And when we kind of started speaking to some publications and some information got out there, it kind of like snowballed from there. And a lot more people started talking about it and views were coming out. The consultation period was extended, and there was a really, really good engagement from our network and beyond. And the consultation, some of the things that we were asking for were kind of were met in the response. So it wasn't a kind of like a complete victory from our campaign, but some of the things. So, for example, the height at which they were proposing to bring the ban down to wasn't all the way down to the worst case scenario. It was halfway in between, which was a part victory. And then after that, we did the carbon footprint of construction report. And that was the first time ACAN had actually done its own publication. And it was a kind of, I don't know, maybe 9-month effort from the group. And it was all about the opportunities through regulating embodied carbon in construction. So we did a kind of big eye-opener on the fact that it wasn't, the fact that, I think it's the carbon footprint of construction materials in the UK is higher than 198 countries' carbon footprints as a country. All sorts of stats that are now very commonplace. But we also came with solutions. So C40 had done a brilliant piece of work of collating policies and regulations that support reducing embodied carbon in construction, but not explicitly through regulating embodied carbon. So they were other things like prioritizing retrofit and the positive impacts that has, prioritizing bio-based materials and positive impacts. And we basically picked the most suitable and useful ones that we thought for England, UK, and we put that together in a publication with these kind of high-level findings. And we did a briefing note and came up with the Part Z slogan, which then completely fortuitously dovetailed perfectly with the Part Z campaign, which was developed in isolation that happened to have exactly the same name. And that campaign is still going, which is really great. And hopefully someday we will have embodied carbon regulation, but we still don't. And that is a massive, massive issue, because without the regulation of embodied carbon reductions, we know that it just won't happen at a national scale. We know that there are some organizations, some clients, some projects which have really excelled it, but we know that we need to get every house builder doing this. We need every single project to be addressing embodied carbon in construction. And until it's regulated, it won't. And we've got France has been doing it. We've got Holland, Denmark, Netherlands, America's been doing it. So there are loads of examples of how it can be done. And the positive outcomes that through doing it, you get these increased use of bio-based materials in our built environment, which has all sorts of, social and direct benefits. But it's still not regulated. Government's still yet to kind of actually state when it will be regulated. Government still hasn't consulted on it. Unfortunately, the Tory government said they were going to, but they never did. So it's still frustrating that we're not there.
Crazy. What's the new government doing? Do you know? Have they responded to it at all?
Not directly that I'm aware of. There was some reports that were commissioned by the previous government, one by DESNA, one by DLUC, Department of Energy Security Net Zero, and Department for Levelling Up and Housing Community, which I think has been rebranded since. Those publications haven't been publicized, they're not made public yet, and I'm not aware of any kind of new commitment to consulting on regulating embodied carbon in construction. But there is a timber and construction cross-departmental and cross-industry group, which I believe has been mentioned before by previous guests on the show. It was developed under the Conservative government. It's yet to be formally recognised by the Labour government. But what it set out to do was to close the gap between political ambition of getting more timber construction and the kind of regulations and policies that we currently have, some of which kind of actively work against the political ambition of getting more timber construction and more woodlands into management. So I'm kind of involved in that group with a couple of hats on, and that's got some really good kind of initiatives to try and help the industry. But until embodied carbon is regulated and everyone has to do it, it's not going to have the systemic uptake that needs to happen. It's kind of like the leaders at the moment and some local authorities which have started setting their own targets and obligations.
Why do you think the UK is, in a way, so late with this? Is it because there's not even enough people shouting about it because of political reasons? Why is that? And to me, it sounds
really
like
good question, Mark.
To me, the Brits are very open-minded in my mind, and especially in terms of sustainability. Again, it's so much easier to have a plant-based diet in the UK than in France, and France are still very conservative with all this, but they seem to be very proactive with sustainability. But is it just because of the governments? Is it because there's not enough people lobbying about it? Maybe you don't have the answer.
I can give my opinion on it and the bits that I've picked up along the way. My understanding is that to regulate something in the UK through building regulations, the government needs to have a really good understanding of what that looks like, what that feels like, knowing that the industry will be able to deliver it before it brings in the regulation, and has previously had the opinion that there is not enough data to kind of like communicate all of those aspects. So that is something that the timber industry, for example, has been working very proactively to get the data to show we can do this. We have the trained staff, we have the software, we have the data, we have buildings that have done it, we've got design teams that have done it, we are ready to do this. And I think, and that's my understanding of regulation in England. That said, we had the combustible material ban that was brought in almost overnight, which demonstrates that we can regulate things very kind of proactively. So I think there's a kind of like an example there that we can in England regulate kind of very quickly if we want to, if we feel it needs to be done. And given that every local authority signed the climate emergency back in 2019, everyone, like, I think, that's a statement showing that local authorities acknowledge things needed to be done. There's a really different example I'll give from Scotland, where they brought in a bit of regulation for new schools, knowing that the industry wasn't there. So they brought in a funding metric for new schools that links funding to the energy in use of a school, which is revolutionary. And it said the developer will get their money back when the school achieves energy use of 67 kilowatt hours a square meter a year. And there's a sliding pay scale. So the worse it performs, the less money the developer gets back. And if they're worse than 132 kilowatt hours, they get none of their money back against this component. And what's quite interesting is the average energy use intensity of a school in Scotland is about 160 kilowatt hours. So this Scottish kind of like the Scottish Futures Trust payment scale basically says if you deliver an average school, you won't get your money back, Mr. and Mrs. Developer. And when they announced this policy, they never used the word Passivhaus, but everyone knew that if you needed a guaranteed outcome, there was only one demonstrated way of doing that in the sector, and that's through using Passivhaus. And at the point when they announced this policy, there was only one Passivhaus contractor in Scotland. So they took the approach of, let's say what needs to be done, and then the supply chain will respond, rather than waiting till you've got the supply chain before you bring in the regulation. And best built environment Scottish transformation, I believe, or smart transformation was kind of brilliant. It was recognized as like the support center for upskilling the industry around this funding metric. And I think in about 2.5 years' time, they had 1,000 individuals trained up in Passivhaus. They had 100 contractors trained up in Passivhaus, and they've got, I think, close to 30 projects on site using this funding metric, almost all of which are going for Passivhaus. And, for me, that's an amazing example of the exciting things that can be done through proactive regulation. And, and I think that's a really good example of having some faith in the supply chain, and kind of, the market will respond. We don't need to wait until we have the numbers and all of the, having resolved everything before we say, let's regulate embodied carbon.
That's very interesting. Does Architype have, I think you said you've got an office in Edinburgh, Scotland?
We do, yes. And it's an absolute privilege to get to work in England, Scotland and Wales, because they all have different approaches to policies and targets and regulation and materials. And so it's really exciting to be able to work in the three and talk to the three, because we are involved with governments in each three countries, and we are able to have these sort of kind of like holistic conversations, sharing kind of these thought leadership pieces that the different countries are doing.
Right. What's your involvement with, maybe let's stay on the Passivhaus design. I asked ChatGPT, but with Passivhaus design, but to have an idea. But can you give me your definition of Passivhaus, and also what it takes to be a Passivhaus designer?
Absolutely. So Passivhaus is a energy and comfort standard that was developed over 25 years ago in Germany by someone called Wolfgang Feist, I believe, in Darmstadt. And the idea was to have a building, a home that was so efficient in its form factor, in its ventilation, in its air tightness and its thermal continuity, that it could be heated from the energy given off by its occupants. That was the the origin. Since then, it has said you can have 15 kilowatt hours square meter of heat, but ostensibly you're saying you've got an exceptionally efficient building, and then you only need a little bit of energy to make it comfortable and also make it healthy. And there are certain core principles to a passive house. So you've got to have a continuous insulation line around the whole building. That means that you most of the time need to be using triple glazed windows to get decent U values. The frames you normally have to use certified windows, or you kind of have to allow a fudge factor because the frames are so significant. The second one is a air tightness layer. So you've got to have a continuous air tightness layer, which is literally orders of magnitude better than building regulations. Interestingly, building regulations talks about air permeability, like how leaky a building is. In Passive House, we talk about the air tightness. So it's the same spectrum, but the other end of things. You've then got to have a ventilation heat recovery system. And what that does is it recovers about 90% of the energy, the heat energy of the air being expelled, and it transfers that heat energy to the fresh air that's coming in. So you're not mixing air, you're just transferring the energy from the exhaled air to the intake air, which I'll very happily talk about in our healthcare and school setting. And you've also got to manage your solar gains. So it's not about having huge amounts of glazing, it's about having the right amount of glazing in the right orientation, so that yes, you can benefit from your solar gains in your winter months, but you're not hampered by too much solar gains in your summer months. And we use the Passivhaus planning package, which is an Excel tool to basically design and develop all of those things holistically, simultaneously. And the outcomes of that are really energy efficient buildings. And we're talking like 85, 90% lower energy use than a building regulation building. And we've got that data in use. So it's not just a design intent. We know these buildings work. You also have healthy buildings. So because you've got continuous airflow, because you've got a really airtight building, you can then have a continuous mechanical ventilation system that uses tiny amounts of energy because it's so efficient. And that means you've got fresh air with low CO2 concentrations. You can filter out particulate matter, which is really important in urban environments. And you've got good environment for people using the buildings. And it's called Passive House, but you can actually use it on any sector. So we've done offices, we've done hospitals, we've done schools from primary through to universities. We're currently doing swimming pools. We've done museums and art galleries and archive buildings. And I think we're even looking at a cinema as well at the moment. So you can apply the principles. And I think people should kind of like, there's a lot of stigma attached to the word passive house, but you can just look at it as building physics, and the building physics will always happen, and you can either choose to design for it or not.
Can you retrofit a building into passive house standard, as in standard brick, single brick or houses?
Yes,
is it possible?
Yes, you can. It's got its own title called NMITE. So NMITE is is Passivhaus for retrofit. And it's the same principles, but slightly more relaxed targets. Still, very good. We're talking an air tightness of 1 air change an hour instead of, 10 to 15. And if you're interested, we recently did an NMITE on a 1930s telephone exchange in Cambridge, which was done in a conservation area, which is quite interesting because the windows are really significant when it comes to energy efficiency and also good daylighting. And in a conservation area, you've always going to have more of a conversation with the planners about what you can do. But we internally retrofitted that building with bio-based materials. So we use wood fiberboard and diathanite, which is a cork-based plaster. And we use that to internally line the whole building. And then obviously we use mechanical ventilation heat recovery combined with air source heat pump. And the building is now in use, and its energy use reduction is about 86% lower than before the retrofit work, which is, absolutely phenomenal. It's actually currently operating at the 2050 energy target for the net zero carbon building standard. And that's today, and it was designed 2019. So that's quite exciting.
Yeah, we're actually talking at the moment with my wife about making our isolating mainly more our house because it's absolutely freezing. But obviously it's very expensive. So what are the solutions, and can we do it in phases? Are we going to break the line of isolation as well if we do it in phases? Is it bad if we actually create a line and we've got no choice because we can't spend all the money on at the same time? Do we need could we have a air source heat pump? All those discussions at the moment. You don't have to answer. You can answer if you want, but we're probably going to need to.
There's a really interesting piece of work done by Leeds Beckett University in the last few years, and they retrofitted 200 homes, and they did them in a number of different ways in order to see, do you get the same outcome? And positively, they did demonstrate that you can go about it in a stepwise manner. So you can do walls, then floors, then ceiling. And as long as you get to the holistic endpoint and you make sure that the connections between the different interventions are connected, so you haven't got a cold bridge where your internal wall insulation meets your internal roof insulation, but you don't do the junction. As long as you do all the junctions, you can get to the same outcome as if you did it in one hit, which obviously is a kind of positive for the kind of cash flow reality of retrofitting homes. However, they did also show that it showed how important the walls are to do, because they are so much of the surface area of the building. If you don't do the walls, the other measures can very easily increase the internal mold risk. So it's really, really important that the walls are done. And their work also showed that the walls are the most important thing for reducing the operational energy cost. So if you want a solution whereby you're actually going to be recouping your investment, you need to make sure the walls are done. And unfortunately, the walls are one of the harder things to do. If you do it internally, you've got to reconfigure things. You're losing floor area. It's very disruptive. And you can't do as much as if you do it on the outside. But if you're doing it on the outside, you've got planning considerations. You've got to have really good detailing. And also you've got to change certain things like the eaves detail to make sure you've got decent weatherproofing and stuff. So it is really, really challenging. But it can be done stepwise, provided you get to that endpoint.
That's interesting. Yeah, I completely agree. At the moment, our question is, but we need to touch the windows because the seals are not going to be long enough if we add insulation outside. And yes, we would like to touch the windows, but obviously we need to do it at the same time, or the windows first, and then we do the walls. Then all the plumbing is outside, it on the side, but we know that obviously if you add insulation outside, then you have to shift all the plumbing so that it's outside. It's like, massive, it's a massive job. And inside, obviously, everything's been renovated. So it's very hard to lose space. It's very, very difficult. But anyway, that's my life. What's your involvement with Timber Development UK, NMITE, and ASBP? It's been one go, but
I've been on the sustainability committee for the Timber Development UK for a number of years now. That came whilst I was wearing my ACAN hat. And the aim of that committee is to make sure that the whole supply and value chain, from forestry management all the way through to people using buildings, is represented on that committee, which I found really engaging and rewarding, because it means we can have very robust conversations about trying to change one bit of it and seeing all of the impacts it has along the value chain. And I know that Kelly spoke previously around the decarbonization of the timber industry. That was one of the kind of like main things that's been worked on for the last couple of years. And there are a number of free resources, for example, developing carbon footprint data for generic timber use in the UK, which is really useful data, and it's on there for people to go and have a look at, along with case studies. So that sustainability committee has a kind of subcommittee of carbon nerds, which I'm also a member of, and that's kind of been seconded by this timber and construction kind of governmental industry working group to kind of provide the data to have a really robust argument for some of the kind of policy and regulations proposals coming from that group. ASBP,
Great.
Very different, but kind of very compatible in the same space. It's great to hear that you've had a conversation with Simon Corby. I've recently been appointed as a board member, taking over from Ben Humphreys, one of our directors who's been on the board for 7 years. So that's kind of only just begun for me within ASBP. But through ACAN, we had a very close relationship with ASBP whilst we were kind of doing our campaigning work and developing our kind of carbon footprint of the construction industry report, because they've done a phenomenal job of trying to upskill the industry when it comes to embodied carbon impacts of materials and what is an environmental product declaration and how do I do a life cycle assessment. All of those webinars are available on their website. So very much recommend people go and have a look at that if they've got questions, because it's all free.
Yeah, I confirm. There's a lot of really interesting documents and information, especially also on the timber development UK, accessible to everybody, not just experts. But I found quite a few blogs and blog posts or seminars really interesting from both parties. And NMITE, sorry.
Yeah, that's a more recent one for me. I've been asked to be an advisor on the kind of educational direction of NMITE. So NMITE is a organization that's looking at education in the different aspects of the supply chain again of timber. And it's very near and dear to our heart because they've got a campus in Hereford where they have recently opened their Centre for Advanced Timber Technology, which is a wonderful course. And they've got a huge space, which currently actually has a mock-up of the Gen Zero timber classroom that was developed for the Department for Education. And it was constructed for COP26 in Glasgow. But it's a wonderful progressive organization. I recommend having a look at their website because they actually currently have positions for their courses that are starting in the new year. And it can be, they have undergraduate courses and further qualification courses, but they also do short courses for anyone who's involved in timber, in construction in any respect. So I recommend having a look at those. And like Timber Development UK, you will be on these courses with people from all aspects of the supply chain. So we had an architectural colleague who was there last year working alongside a contractor, carpenter, a developer, and a landowner. And you're all learning the same things, but you're having these very stimulating conversations.
Very interesting. I forgot to ask you what it takes to be a Passivhaus designer.
Yes.
Training you need to take and qualification.
Yeah. So to become a CEF designer, so that's a certified Passivhaus designer, you have to do a course. There are a number available. Coaction is the organization I got my training through during COVID. It's a very thorough course. You can do it alongside your job with some kind of educational leave, I guess. And and it teaches you about the fundamentals, but then also the kind of like the calculations that you have to be able to do. It teaches you about the Passivhaus planning package and how to use it, and also the constructional kind of quality assessment aspect of it. That was something I didn't mention earlier, but Passivhaus has proven itself as a way of delivering a performance gap-free building. And that's actually the reason why Architype moved to using Passivhaus for our buildings, because we discovered the performance gap on our own buildings 15 years ago, despite, following all of the sustainability kind of like fundamentals. And we discovered this methodology. So the quality assurance is this really important thing that goes all the way through the design, because you have to understand all of the information to be able to put it into this Passivhaus planning package. And then you need to make sure that those are the exact materials which are used on site. So you have to verify everything as it arrives on site. And then you have to verify that it's been put together on site as it had been designed. So all the details are photographed and really understood to make sure that the continuity of the airtightness has been achieved, to make sure that the materials have been cut flush in a way that there's no route for thermal or air bypass. And all of that quality assurance that goes through the whole site process is kind of a large part of why you get these buildings that perform as designed, because it makes sure that there isn't those deviations, or those deviations are mitigated as far as possible when you're on site. So the qualification also teaches you about how you need to go through that process, the things to look out for. So, I mean, that's why I said earlier, really it's building physics, because all of these things are, and also why you can use it for any sector, because all of these things are true. All of these things should have a continuous line of insulation, and they should have continuous airtightness. But for a number of reasons, that doesn't happen on the majority of our buildings. So that's the certified designer. There's also a certified contractor hat, which you can get. That I mentioned that earlier. And you don't have to be an architect to be a certified Passivhaus designer. It's not a requirement. Which I think is really positive, because it broadens the opportunities. And then
so
another
a
really
Passivhaus
important
designer,
part,
basically.
absolutely, and provided, and there is an exam that I didn't mention. There is an exam which is it's quite grueling. It's kind of like an architectural exam where you've got to do a lot of calculation, a lot of information in a kind of quite intense period. And the last thing, which I haven't mentioned, is that there's a certifier. And this is a really important aspect of the quality assurance journey when you go on a Passivhaus building design. So the Passivhaus certifier is a third party appointed by the client who makes sure that the designer is doing what they should be doing, but also kind of double checks their answers and actually works things out in parallel to the designer working things out. So there's a kind of really good kind of scrutiny of the design process, and the certifier needs to be satisfied that all of the things have been achieved through the design stages, and then also on site, which is all part of that quality assurance, making sure you get the outcome that you set out for.
I'll introduce my question on mostly bio-based materials, but there's a performance space where I'm working on at the moment, where we're designing a box-in-box system, and it's all timber. The aspiration is to have it net zero in construction and operation, which is great. Don't know, it's being designed at the moment. And we're suggesting reclaimed paving slabs for the roof construction, potentially hemp for the inner box instead of hempcrete, instead of block work. And there's also a great product that we're going to have on the podcast. It's called Eco Cocoon, and it's basically panels, prefab panels made with straw. I don't know if you know about it, because I know George is an ambassador of the brand or something like this. But yeah, and what but it's all very like question marks, and because acoustics had to drive the design because it's so sensitive to noise, the site. I wonder whether the contractors, or I'm not like throwing the stone at the constructor, but somebody or all those very sustainable solutions would be scrapped out for more masonry and carbon intense materials. And I wonder if it's very typical to the UK, or if there's not going to be any problem in it. Everybody's going to be very happy and it's going to be a massive success. But yeah, basically Simon said, Corby said, natural fibers, natural insulation is underutilized in the UK. And there needs to be a change in the way we think about those materials, and maybe they don't have the resistance we want. Obviously, we will have to recognize it, but when we can use them, let's use them to their full potential. How do you, obviously from Archetype, you can see maybe a very positive side, and you can drive this even more than I do, or acoustic consultants can do on projects. But what's your take on all this, on especially what Simon said, and what do you think the solution is?
I'm going to be careful not to go into a game of Simon Says. I'm really tempted. But I mean, yes, we are really, really fortunate at Archetype to get to kind of give the kind of viewpoint from very progressive opportunities and clients. And, we've had some amazing kind of opportunities to really explore and kind of prioritize natural materials and bio-based solutions. I completely agree with Simon that it's significantly underutilized within the industry and in the country. There's a fascinating book that's recently been written by Paul Brennan called Timber. I highly recommend it as a very easy read, as a amazingly in-depth and referenced insight to what could be possible if we really endorsed and backed a kind of systemic shift towards bio-based material. And it's not just timber, it's wood-based products, things like miscanthus and hemp, and at a European and national and international scale. So I think those are all the positives. And I think there are better ways or rather, in order to safeguard those outcomes, you need to kind of change the way that you do business. It doesn't just happen, and anyone who's kind of like been able to use those materials in projects knows that you've got to champion it all the way through, because unfortunately there's an inertia within the constructions industry to do things the way that they have been done. And we've been seeing this on our own house build project at the moment. And it's so understandable why that happens, but it does mean that you've got to really protect those ambitions, those material ambitions on projects. But the positive is, each time you do it, you're positively reinforcing that outcome. So in your designers, those are the details that they're used to doing. Those are the things we're used to speaking to contractors and subcontractors about. They're the things we're most used to talking to building control about using. And they're the things that we're familiar with speaking to insurers about insuring. So you can end up with this positive feedback cycle. And that's kind of this very special place that Archetype get to operate in. But I also fully appreciate that is not representative of the industry at scale. And that's, part of one of the big challenges, but also opportunities that come with it. And this is where, Paul Brannan's book says so rightly that you can get these huge scale positive outcomes through changing to doing things differently, you can introduce 10% of your farm can be given over to trees, and you can still have 100% yield of your crops. And you've improved the rainfall resilience of your land. You've increased the quality of the soil, and you've got another £3,000 per hectare of income from the trees that you can harvest. But I fully appreciate all of these things need championing and safeguarding for them to happen. And I think it's interesting if Simon talked about the resilience of maybe it was talking about the fire kind of resistance of bio-based materials and natural insulation, and that is one of the really big barriers that the industry has been facing. And I've been asking government to explore something that's been done on the continent for quite a few years now. There's an amazing website called dataholz.eu, Data of Wood, and it was developed by the Austrian and German governments because they wanted more timber in construction. And the website makes freely available embodied carbon information, fire performance information, and thermal resistance information of timber
and acoustic information,
elements, products, details, and assemblies. And that kind of helps plug that data gap to give everyone reassurance through the whole kind of like project team that it's okay, you can do it with these materials and you can get the outcomes that you want. I think the UK should develop a similar platform with the kind of ways that we use materials in this country and with our climate. And I think that would be a really helpful thing for helping the industry kind of transition to this building safety kind of future whilst using bio-based materials.
There's also acoustic information in Dataholz that because I've been using it quite a lot for design as well. So I love the website.
That's brilliant.
Obviously, I haven't looked at the thermal information and all the rest of it. Just the acoustic information. Talk to me about your house. You've got a really interesting project.
We do. So my wife and I are currently self-building our house called Laamacroft in Hereford. So I met Jana, my wife, studying architecture at CAT, and she set up her own practice called Grain because she couldn't find a practice that was kind of committed to natural materials as much as she thought was needed to kind of really kind of attain this kind of really climate conscious kind of future. And she has been a designer since she was a kid. She started designing our house when she was 6. And basically it was kind of like when screening men in her life, very early on, it was like, I come with a house design, does that work or not? And it's a beautiful house. It's a symphony of bio-based solutions. So we've got no concrete on site. The house is a prefabricated timber frame construction. Uses Larson trusses, so timber web timber, which is just a ply gusset plate, and it's very nice because you can have it's sized to the structural requirements of your project, and it uses small section timber. So you can use C16 homegrown timber, can be built up by 2 lads in a warehouse over the winter, so they get kind of warmer, drier working environment. And the panels come to site on the back of a lorry. We've got a screw pile ground bearing system, which is really cool to see go in. Longest one's only 1.85 meters. And then we've got a glue lam ring beam. Then the timber panels sit on that. And the timber panels are then later on, they've got a wood fiber board on the outer face. And then the zone is fully filled with warm cell, which is shredded newspaper insulation. And then we've got lime render on the outside. And the slates on the roof are reclaimed from a old Welsh castle, which is quite exciting. But this sits on an 1.5 acre plot that we've got with my parents-in-laws, and they're building their house right next door to us. Similar materials, similar details, but not going for Passivhaus certification. They recently had their airtightness tests. So Passivhaus, you need to achieve 0.6 air changes an hour. building regulations are somewhere around kind of like the 8 to 10 realm. And our house achieved 0.28. So kind of really, really excited by that. And we're also using a lot of natural materials from the site inside. So the house is being plastered using clay from our garden. We have a very high clay content soil in Hereford with a really dark, beautiful red tone. And we are using that as our plaster. And we are kind of plastering onto lath and plaster. We're making our own homemade lath from all the timber offcuts. The builders haven't removed any offcuts from site. We've got a big wood store and we're making our own lath. And we're using something called light earth for the infill of our internal walls, which is straw dressed in a clay slip, which you can render onto. And Jan has been leading some material weeks through the summer. So we've had, I think, about 40 volunteers this year now. We did a material week on reclaiming timber. We did a material week on straw bale construction. And we've done a material week on light earth and one on clay plastering. So we've had people from the Forestry Commission, we've had developers, architects, lecturers, homeowners come and volunteer week at a time, living on site. And they all leave with a massive grin on their face, having just kind of been hands into it with natural materials for a week, which is beautiful to see.
You need to document all this. Obviously, you've got a website. Can you tell me the address?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is Laamacroft, and I'm just going to check if it's .org or .com. So it's lama-croft.com. And you'll also find us on Instagram. It's Laamacroft_HR4. And my wife's done a very good job of recording it all, filming it in clips and posting it. We did actually apply to Grand Designs to be on it. And we, quite intentionally, our house is not a grand design. Like it's quite a modest design. And they replied accordingly, basically saying it wasn't grand enough. It wasn't, showy off enough. But we're very happy to kind of be sharing the updates of our modest design as we go on our website. And we take part in the Passivhaus Open Days. So we did our first one in October this year. We'll be doing the next one in the spring. You're always welcome to come and have a look. And you'll also see volunteering opportunities on our website. So as things go up, they'll be hosted there. We've also been doing something called WWOOFing, which is Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. So we've got 1.5 acres on which we've got allotment gardening, we've got bees, we've got chickens, we've got fruit cages and polytunnels, and we've been using the WWOOF kind of community. Again, we've had about 35 volunteers, normally in groups of 2, come and volunteer their time to live on site with us, which is all about developing community resilience. And it was a very intentional decision from my wife and I to find a bit of land where we could kind of set up and really become a part of a kind of resilient community, because we ultimately accepted that things are going to get very, very difficult in the coming decades as the climate changes and continues to deteriorate. And ultimately, we've decided to invest in that local resilience, for our future and for our families.
It's like the little dream house where you're gonna.
It's very thrilling, very thrilling.
Makes me think about, in a way, River Cottage as well, in a different way.
Nice.
Great. It's been very nice to talk to you. It's gone over an hour, which I'm trying to respect, but I would have liked to to ask you more questions on sustainability in construction and such stuff like this. Maybe we can have another episode one day about another specific topic. But yeah, thank you very much, Seb. It was very, very interesting. Everything you said was really, really interesting, and I hope the guests will find it as well. interesting as I
Thank you
found it.
very much, Mark, for having me. It's my first podcast, so
Yeah,
thank you very much for the invitation.
You've done very well, and again, it was very clear and very detailed. So yeah, thank you again for accepting the invite, and hopefully I'll see you soon again.
Thank you, and I'll happily come back for a part 2 down the line.
Yeah. Cheers, Seb.
Take care. Bye.